Welcome to Around the Empire, the show that takes you around the U.S. Empire. I'm your host, Dan Wright.
I'm your host, Joanne Leon.
And on today's show, August 4th, 2017, we speak to Elijah Magnier on Iraq and Syria. Elijah has covered wars in Lebanon, the Balkans, Iraq, Sudan, Libya, and Syria. And beyond reporting from the ground, he also has offered expert analysis on terrorism and terrorist organizations. Here is that interview.
Hello, Elijah. Welcome to the show. Elijah is joining us from Baghdad.
Hi, Joanne. Yes, thank you for having me again. I am in Baghdad, and Baghdad is a beautiful city. It's not only war here, but very kind people, and I'm always happy to come to Iraq.
Well, that's good to hear. So, Elijah, I read a couple of weeks ago, you have a post called First Islamic State, and then the U.S. breaches Sykes-Picot with one objective, the partition of Syria and Iraq. And I think that question is one of the questions that's probably foremost in people's minds, is trying to understand now that the CIA quote-unquote moderate rebel program has been shut down, supposedly, where are we going from here? How about if I just turn this over to you and give us an overview of what's going on right now and your assessment?
Okay, well, there are two countries here that are in the middle of the event. It's Iraq and Syria, and they are pretty much linked, even if things are happening separately, but they are really linked. So we can start in the north of Iraq, which is Kurdistan, Iraq, where the leader of the Kurdish area, Masoud Barzani, decided to hold a referendum on the 25th of September to test the will of the Kurdish population and to move forward toward an independent state from the central government of Baghdad and to create a Kurdistan, Iraq. Now, it is already an autonomous part of the country where there are Kurds living since 1991 independently from Baghdad. And then following the American invasion to the country, the status of Kurdistan remained in an autonomous. And it is also quoted in the Iraqi constitution as well, where Baghdad is supposed to share the financial burden of Kurdistan and to pay the 17% of the oil revenue of the area under the Kurds' control, and also to discuss about the other Kurdish Arab area in different parts of the country to discuss their fate and to see what can be done in a negotiation with the central government about these areas. And they are in the northeast, in the north, and in the northwest. Now, what happened is Barzani is moving ahead and he wants to declare an independent Kurdistan, although he has retracted a little bit by saying, my aim is to respond to the will of the Kurds. The will of the Kurds has always been to create an independent state. Rightly, they are between 25 to 30 million Kurds who would like to have their own state, even if they have different ideology. The one in Syria are different from the one in Iraq, and the one in Turkey are different from Kurdistan, Iraq, and the one in Balochistan in Iran are also different in ideology, but they are all Kurds, and they all come together when there is a danger on Kurds. But this step is very premature because, first of all, Iraq is not ISIS-free, and the presence of ISIS is still in the north of the country, in Hawija, and in the west, in Ana, Rawa, until reaching Al-Qaim, the border between Syria and Iraq, and that's the most difficult and dangerous area. Furthermore, the central government of Baghdad is facing a difficult financing situation. It's really bankrupt, basically. and Kurdistan is also facing financial difficulties. Baghdad is not paying what's supposed to pay to Kurdistan, but that is not the reason for Kurdistan to declare an independent state. I think an autonomous state is good for the time being. So when things will settle, they can go further in their discussion with Baghdad. Now we can see the Americans moving from Kurdistan, Iraq to Kurdistan, Syria, because now we have Kurdistan, Syria, which are more or less on the same borders. And then we have between Kurdistan, Iraq and Kurdistan, Syria, they only need to cross from the area of Sinjar, and then they will be in Al-Hasaka province under the Kurdish Syrian control. Now the Americans have moved to the Kurdistan, Syria, without the permission of the central government of Baghdad. So they're moving forces from one country to another, breaking the Sykes-Picot agreement and breaking the borders exactly as ISIS did in 2014. Moreover, the Americans are encouraging the Kurds in Syria to have an independent state or federation when things also are very premature. First, ISIS is not defeated yet. Second, Kurdistan, Syria is not autonomous. Third, it is not the way to force a partition of a country without the Kurds, Syrian, who are Syrians, negotiating with the central government of Damascus to negotiate a kind of federation, which I think Damascus would be very happy to give, but not to see their country divided into an area under the American control. And the Americans have moved from Al-Hasaka, which is the far northeast of Syria, and they moved to the central east at Al-Tanaf crossing between Syria, trying to impose a kind of red lines. Now, this is where the Russians, the Iranians, and the Syrians and their allies on the ground move 50 to 70 kilometers above the strategic, what they call a strategic military US-UK base based on the Iraqi-Syrian borders on the Sykes-Picot line without the approval of the central government in Syria. And of course, Baghdad doesn't have a say now, but we saw immediately the Iraqi security forces that are battalions of the Popular Mobilization Forces moving opposite the American base on the Iraqi side to tell them nobody's going to cross from here to Iraq and your presence is really useless. So what the Iranians and the Russians and Damascus forces and their allies did is they just went above the strategic American military illegal base in At-Tanaf, and they closed the road on the Americans and saying, okay, now we need this area to start liberating Deir ez-Zor from ISIS, where ISIS has a stronghold going down from Deir ez-Zor, which is on the northeast, and down to Al-Mayadin to reach Al-Bukamal and Al-Qa'im on the Iraqi-Syrian borders. And now the Americans are finding themselves completely cut off from the rest of Syria in the area of Al-Tanaf, and they're starting to give up on all the what they call moderate Syrian rebels fighting in Al-Badia, which is a semi-desert in the southeast and in the east of Syria. And they're gradually giving up on supporting them. And these forces are finding their way of reconciliation with the government of Damascus, taking the US weapons with them, saying, thank you very much for supplying us with weapons. And they move these, the weapons and every effective they've got from the Americans to the Syrian army. And they say, this is what we've got from the Americans. We don't want to fight against you. And the Americans are giving up on us, which is not the first time the Americans do that, because they really don't have allies. They have common interests.
Oh, boy. Yeah, I'd seen Pentagon briefing where I think it was the first time they'd spoken on the Al-Tanf, and said that the U.S.-backed rebels there, I don't recall the name of that group, but they said, we're going to get the weapons back from them. We're going to get
Maghawir al-Thawra, this is the name.
I see. Can you say that one more time?
Maghawir al-Thawra. So
Maghawir al-Thawra, okay.
Yeah,
I
the
probably
special
should say
forces. Yeah, special forces of the revolution, more or less.
Yeah. So every journalist in the room was really interested in this topic, and he got a lot of questions about it. And, he said they were still negotiating, but they were going to get those supplies and weapons back. So you're saying like that didn't happen?
Well, they've already joined, not all of them, but many of them joined the Syrian army with their weapons. I'm not sure the Syrian army would find a way to communicate with the Americans and give them back the weapons they've supplied to the Syrian moderate rebels.
Oh,
I think logistically it will be difficult because there is no direct line. Unless, Assad will decide to give up these weapons to the Russian and the Russian to give them to the American. I think it's a bit complicated. We don't know who's going to pay for this.
Okay, so wait. So these weapons that the CIA, this is from the CIA program, right? So these weapons initially found their way into Al-Nusrah's hands, and now you're saying some of these weapons are ultimately going to end up in Assad's hands.
Of course, they have already. So first they supply Al-Nusrah, and they consider Al-Nusrah as an Al-Qaeda. And this is something is beyond us, really, because if you are an American institution representing the American government and you're supplying Al-Qaeda with weapons, and then you consider Al-Qaeda as a terrorist organization, which I think is responsible for 9/11, unless they've changed their mind now. And then they supply them with weapons, and then they say, oh, we still consider them as a terrorist group, but we allow Turkey to supply them. And Turkey is a NATO country that can supply weapons and ammunition and logistic and support and everything they need, Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Everything can happen in Syria.
Wow. Yeah, that's true. Anything can happen in Syria, can't it? And I take it that the Syrian army and coalition are still moving pretty rapidly to the east, and they still have, as you said, the roads cut off to Deir ez-Zor. Are they? I think the last I saw, they were about 60 kilometers away from Deir ez-Zor, roughly.
The Syrian army is moving from three fronts, really. It is the Syrian army is moving from the Tabqa front at Tabqa, so just the same line, having the YPG, the Kurdish American forces above them, and they're going on the same line toward Deir ez-Zor. They're moving on the second line from Al-Sukhna, and then a third line from Al-Badia. So these are three fronts. And what they are saying, they're saying the one that arrived first will be the one that is going to fight ISIS first. And because all three fronts are difficult fronts, and there's a very vast territory in the area there we're talking about, the only difficult one is Al-Sukhna, because there are 20 to 30 villages on the road. But on the other hand, the Syrian army and their allies are forced to protect their flanks and move on three fronts to distract and divert the attention of ISIS and move separately but united toward one objective, which is Deir ez-Zor. Now, the one who's going to reach first, in my guess, is I think the line of Tabqa, and that may slow down waiting for the others to move faster and to reach all three fronts together close to Deir ez-Zor. And what we are seeing now is ISIS very aware of the situation, and they're calling for the first time ever, we've seen that since 2014, mobilization, a forced mobilization for all the young men who are between 20 and 30, asked by ISIS to join the arm and prepare to support ISIS militants in Deir ez-Zor, preparing for the big battle.
So they they think that the civilians in Deir ez-Zor are going to join ISIS? Is that what they're calling for?
No, they think the civilians living under ISIS in the area that is in Al-Mayadin, that is close to Deir ez-Zor, a bit south of Deir ez-Zor, and the area of Al-Bukamal, Al-Qaim, all the civilians can join ISIS to participate, to defend, or to attack Deir ez-Zor. I don't think Deir ez-Zor will fall in the hands of ISIS.
Right. But in that same region, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurds and the Americans, have they not also tried to recruit, any willing fighters from that area to join the Arab contingents of the SDF, or was that kind of propaganda?
No, that's a very good question. If we look at the history of the American forces in Iraq, we see that they've been very successful in recruiting the Arab tribes that used to be called the Sahwa, the awakening, in Iraq, among the Iraqi tribes. And they have used the awakening forces, as Sahwa, to fight Al-Qaeda in Iraq, that is today ISIS. They're doing the same in the north of Syria, and they're doing the same thing with the tribes in the Al-Hasaka, Al-Raqqa provinces, because there are the majority Arab tribes living in the area. And they need their support because the Kurds are the minority there. If you take Raqqa itself, the Kurds represent 20% of the population of the city of Raqqa. Therefore, the Kurds on their own can never rule the area because it's a vast territory, and the Kurds on their own cannot rule the area. Now, though, the Americans will find many Arabs willing to be paid, to receive money from them, to seek protection, because these are people who are survivals and they want a good income, which the Americans can offer. But you can't buy loyalty. You buy a temporary loyalty as long as you feed them with money. So it's exactly the same. If we learn from history, it seems we don't. The day the Americans stopped paying the awakening forces, Al-Sahwa in Iraq, was the day that many of these started to join Al-Qaeda in Iraq or ISIS today again. So therefore, and in the area, there will be tribes very faithful to the Syrian government, to the central government in Damascus, and there will be others faithful to the Americans and to the one who paid the most. Therefore, yes, they will find support at the moment, but how long? This is not a strategic support. This is a tactical support.
Well, I would think that their number one priority would be protecting their homeland, right? Their home area, their families, and tribal lands, I guess. So aren't they going to go with whoever they think the winner is going to be, the strongest force? Or are they going to go with who they think is going to give them a long-term stability? Or like you said, they're just survivors.
They are in the first hand, they are survivors. So they will try to keep a balance between the Americans and the Kurds. And I mean, by the way, the Kurds in that area are not enemy of the central government of Damascus. Until today, Damascus considered the Kurds rightly as Syrians. They are part of the country. They did not declare war against the central government. They are working along with the Americans, which Damascus is not very unhappy about it, because the Kurds are, at the end of the day, offering a lot of effort, sacrifices, human sacrifices, to liberate that area. But their dream of having a Kurdish state is not going to succeed, particularly because of, first, Syria is not going to allow that. I mean, the central government. Second, Iraq is not going to allow that. Third, Turkey is not going to allow that. And fourth, Iran is not going to allow it. So if we take particularly Turkey, Turkey is going to always hassle the Kurds in Syria. And the only protection the Kurds can enjoy is not from the Americans, but from the Syrian themselves, from the Syrian government. It is if the central government in Damascus is defending the country, supported by the Russian, to preserve the integrity of Syria, that's one thing. Or the the central government of Damascus closing eyes on what the Turks are doing to the Kurds, because the Kurds have decided to side along the Americans that are occupying Syria under no pretext, because the day they defeat ISIS,
Right.
the mandate the Americans have from the United Nations to defeat terrorism anywhere will stop. So how are they going to explain their presence in the northeast of Syria?
Do you think U.S. support, because this is a big question, which is if and when the Kurds, the Kurdish forces, SDF, whatever, defeat the ISIS in Raqqa, what happens? Is the U.S. going to basically throw them under the bus? I don't know if you had that term over there. Basically stop supporting them? Is that once they've been useful in taking out ISIS?
I think the Americans will sooner or later give up on their today's allies, the Kurds, because they will have no legal reason to stay in the country. They can't justify their presence unless they declare themselves an occupation force, and this is where ISIS insurgency, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, the Syrian fighters or the national fighters will all join their forces to attack the Americans, and the Turks will push their proxies to attack the Kurds in Syria. So they will have many enemies, and have so many enemies in a small area, you can't survive for long, even with the financial support of Saudi Arabia that the Kurdish leaders are praising now, which is very unusual.
Yeah, that was really strange.
I mean, it's very unusual to see a Marxist leader that is Saleh Musallim, that's the leader of the SDF, praising a Wahhabi state and fighting at the same time the Wahhabi ideology represented by ISIS.
Yeah.
But again, this is Syria.
Yeah, this is Syria. Well, aren't there bases though? Didn't the U.S.? That's what I'm hearing. That there's multiple. I mean, there's a few bases. Is the U.S. just going to give up those bases?
10 now, they said.
10 bases? That's not really what America does. They put down a base. They want to keep it forever.
So far, I have 10 bases. No, I don't think they can keep it forever. I'm not. I don't think. I mean, keeping it for a few years, it doesn't mean they can keep it forever. They have no reason to be there. They have no legal reason to be there once ISIS is defeated, and unless they want to declare their part as occupied territory. I mean, what the Americans would do with a chunk of Syria they occupy in the far northeast of the country.
Well, what if they called it a safe zone and brought in international peacekeeping troops or something like that?
Between whom and whom?
I'm just saying that I think there's people in the Pentagon right now, the Department of Defense in the United States, figuring out a way to make sure they can somehow keep at least some of the bases they've already set up, because that's the pattern of the U.S. empire, which is, you never give up a base unless you absolutely have to. And they've done so much expansion. That's what's making me think they might not betray the Kurds, or at least betray them so quickly, is, they have an ally, a reliable ally in that region where they have so few others. And I wonder if they're just going to cut and run when they want to keep these bases and they want to maintain an influence. Now, whether President Trump wants that, I have no idea, but that is certainly the national security clique, the intelligence community clique in the U.S. They want to stay in the region and they want to have more territory or more capacity. So, Qatar, this debate with this thing with Qatar and between Saudi Arabia, they're very upset about it because Qatar hosts one of the biggest U.S. military bases in the region, and that's under threat. So I wonder, part of me thinks you're right. They're just going to cut the Kurds loose and let them try to swim in the deep water by themselves. But I think there's also an interest in somehow keeping the bases. They just hate, I don't know, they just hate to give up bases.
Well, here's the thing, Dan. The mission in Syria is starting to morph. And now we hear, neoconservative and interventionists, and in fact, Israel, saying we have to push Iran out of Syria. That's becoming
in the U.S. media,
a more important mission than, after the defeat of ISIS. That's my assessment. That's just my opinion of what I see happening. And
Yeah, well, I mean, that is a way, Elijah, I want you to respond to this. I mean, that is a way in, as you may have known, the Trump administration is basically trying to sabotage the Iran deal. Once that Iran deal if that is actually sabotaged, then we're back into tensions over the supposed nuclear program. I mean, and that would maybe offer a pretext not to leave. What do you think?
Oh, I think we may have lost Elijah.
No. Uh-oh.
Oh, there we go.
I see.
Yeah.
Hey, Elijah.
I'm sorry.
No problem.
Got cut off.
Well, the electricity goes off every 2 hours, so
Oh, no.
yeah.
Okay. How much did you catch? I mean, I think I asked you, might there be a way to keep the bases, or might the...
Yes, I remember now.
Okay, the U.S. is trying to sabotage the Iran deal. Might that tension with Iran be a way for the U.S. to keep the bases? So just your thoughts on how, given the U.S. intention or obsession with expanding military bases all over the world, could maybe, if they sabotage the Iran deal, could that be a way to, if those tensions, is that a justification, do you think? Or what's your take on how the U.S. is going to deal with these bases?
I think the Americans will have to give up on these bases sooner or later, because their presence in the northeast of Syria will not damage Iran at all. Because if we look at the Iran interest in the area, and in Syria in particular, we can see three main interests. First is the base in the Latakia province, which is not a military base, but more as a gas hub to distribute the gas coming from Iran to the rest of Europe or to other continents. The second is the weapons supply line to Hezbollah that goes from Damascus to Beirut, or by the sea in Latakia, Tartus to Beirut, to support Hezbollah. And the third is to have a friendly government in Syria that is part of the axis of the resistance and is not pro-Israeli or pro-American, and is certainly not anti-Iraq or anti-Iran. Therefore, all 3 points today, Iran can say that they've reached these objectives. Therefore, to have a military base in the east of Syria, I think Iran will be delighted to see the Americans sinking in that area, where everybody is going to fight the Americans in the northeast of Syria. And the Americans will be very busy, and they will not win, because they don't have a society that support them. They don't have countries on their borders that accept, in Syria, that accept their presence and what they are doing in supporting the Kurds. So all this plan to reorganize the Middle East and take the Kurds away because ISIS failed to divide the Middle East, I don't think the Americans will succeed on their own with their own troops. They need proxies, and today no proxies are capable of helping the Americans in reaching their objective and fulfilling their objectives. Therefore, the Iranian deal, nuclear deal, has nothing to do with Syria, because Iran will not compromise on that, and Iran did not sign the deal with the Americans, but they signed it with the 5+1, and they signed it with the international community that's
right.
Very happy with it. And second, because Iran reached its objective in Syria and Iraq. And third, because the Americans will keep an illegal presence in the northeast of Syria.
So what do you think the prospects then for Kurdistan are? Do you think it's a pipe dream? I mean, is Kurdistan even on the table? Because that's what the Kurds are fighting for, right? The Kurds are ultimately fighting for their own state, and it seems like every power in the region who would have to, in theory, give up territory for that to happen, including Syria, is completely opposed to this idea.
Well, I think everybody is opposed to the idea that Kurdistan will have a state with the American blessing, because no one trusts the Americans and their plans in the Middle East. And they consider the Americans' bases in the Middle East are there to keep the people of the Middle East busy with each other, fighting each other, and keeping their problems always in the Middle Eastern continent, rather than exporting it to Europe or to other or to other continents, like the Americas or Canada or Australia, wherever. So therefore, I don't think the Americans will have. I don't think the Americans will be happy to stay in an area that the Kurds will not be able to protect, and the Kurds will not be able to protect on their own. The Kurds have the right to have an independent, to have a federation, but with a negotiation with central government. They have to negotiate with Damascus, and they have to negotiate with Baghdad, and they have the right to have their autonomy, but not in the way the Americans are presenting it. The Americans are presenting it as a partition of the country. The Kurds, the Syrian Kurds, are Syrian, like exactly the same, not less, no more than any Syrian living in Damascus. On the contrary, they've been in the country before anyone else, and they were moved, they were pushed from Persia to Turkey and to Syria and to Iraq, and they represent really many millions. But it is the time that is not appropriate, and the medium, that is the Americans with different objectives, that is not really working well for the Kurds.
Oh, so you're saying the Kurds themselves who live in Syria consider themselves more Syrian than necessarily some sort of Kurdish separatist sentiment that you might see in East Turkey, for example. You're saying the Kurds in Syria have a different outlook and don't necessarily find it oppressive to identify or be part of the under Syrian government rule or under Assad's rule?
Well, yes, the Kurds. If you ever heard of the Crac de Chevalier Castle, it is Al-Akrad. That is the Kurds. They've been there. You have Jabal al-Akrad. You have the mountain of the Kurds. The Kurds have been all over Syria, and they are Syrians, like any other Syrian. And they are entitled to stay in Syria like Bashar al-Assad is entitled to stay in Syria. They are not inferior race. They are not another ethnic group that is completely coming from the moon. They are Syrians.
Okay. Now, what about this idea? Because this kind of plays into this idea of sectarian factionalism, which gets a lot of play in the States. It usually comes out of think tanks that, quite honestly, have a lot of Saudi and Qatari funding, and UAE, which is that the idea that there's a Shia crescent being formed, that there's a kind of Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran for influence of the entirety of the Middle East, and that the U.S. should side with the Saudis and be part of this. I know this is probably this is a Washington, D.C. discussion, so it's probably out of touch with reality. But so just what level, how out of touch of reality is this conversation that there's this, a sectarian Cold War going on, and that, Iran is the Shia, I guess, leader, the Soviet Union or whatever this is, and then the Saudis are this other pole, this sort of two poles of vying for influence, and that, there's going to be a Shia crescent and that the Shias are the aggressors.
All right. Okay. So you've raised a very important point, but several points. Let's take one at a time. So if we talk about the Shia aggression, this is really a ridiculous sentence that was raised by Erdogan and by the King of Jordan a long time ago. Now, if we look at the connection between Baghdad and Beirut, because people speak about the connection between Baghdad and Beirut through Damascus and through Tehran, Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut, and they immediately connected it to the weapon supply from Tehran to Beirut. Now, first of all, the weapon supply since 1982, when the beginning of Hezbollah, which coincide with Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 and the removal of the Palestinians from the country. This is when the Iranians went into Zabadani area in Syria, and from there to the Bekaa Valley, and started going down to the rest of the country. And this is when Hezbollah, or different branches of Hezbollah, were formed. We're not into that discussion now, but since 1982, the line between Tehran and Beirut is well established. Whoever was sitting on the throne of Syria, and this comes from Tehran to Beirut via Damascus airport and via the sea, Latakia or Tartus. At the time of Hafiz al-Assad was trying to regulate and to choose what is possible for Hezbollah to have and not to have. With Bashar in power, Bashar not only allowed everything for Hezbollah to receive from Iran and all kinds of weapons, but also opened his own warehouses, particularly in 2006. Therefore, the connection between Baghdad and Damascus is a purely commercial one. The line between Damascus and Baghdad has been going on and off, particularly Al Tanaf and other crossing border in Kamishlo and other parts, wherever when we had the crossing closed between on Al Tanaf for whatever problem, when the Americans decided to close it in 2004, 2005, sometimes they used to close it on and off basis. We used to go to Kamishli and go around it to go down to Baghdad. So this line is a commercial line that has always been there. And the line between Tehran and Baghdad is always open since 2003 and the removal of Saddam Hussein. So this Shia aggression is really a ridiculous sentence that was invented with no base. Now, the second point you've raised is a sectarian issue. Yes, there is a very clear sectarian issue between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and that goes back between Sunni and Shia to 1,400 years ago. It's not new, but it goes on and off in intensity depending who is sitting in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. If we look at previous kings, they were less hard with this approach than the actual one. And if we look at what they call sectarian war in Syria, this is really rubbish because first, the Syrian army is made of 70% of Sunni. Second, those who are fighting the Al-Qaeda and ISIS are mainly Sunni within the Syrian army. Third, the country composition in Syria is made of 70% Sunni. Fourth, the Sunni in Syria control the economy and the Alawite control the security. That agreement was established long ago at the time of Hafiz al-Assad, when he gave the control of the money, the power of the money to the Sunni, because they are the commercial, they are holding the commercial side, and they are the businessmen, and they are very powerful, and they want to work for the prosperity of Syria. And he kept the control of the key points in the army and the intelligence services, because the Alawite and the other Christian and minorities are really, they represent 30% of the entire country. So how we can call it a sectarian war when the Sunni are fighting the Sunni extremists and radicals that are Al-Qaeda and ISIS? Now, if you look at ISIS and Al-Qaeda, ISIS fought against Al-Qaeda and killed hundreds of Al-Qaeda militants, and they both not only Sunni, but they are also Wahhabi. And they're also both holding exactly the same ideology, but one is a little bit more strict than the other and less ready to compromise on several religious issues. If we look at Iraq, for example, among al-Hashd al-Shabi, that is made of 60% Shia and 40% of the rest of the different other religions, is exactly the same percentage that the Iraqi parliament is formed. The Iraqi parliament is formed of 60% Shia and 40% of Sunni, Faili, and all the rest, Christian and other religions in the country. Now, if we look at the casualty of the Hashd al-Shabi, there are to date, this is what I've been told, as the last statistic, between 9,000 to 10,000 Shia killed from al-Hashd al-Shabi while fighting ISIS in the Sunni area of Iraq. So the Shia, particularly those of the south of the country, from Basra, Diwaniyah, and all around it, they are the ones who are fighting ISIS in the far north of Mosul and in Al-Anbar provinces and in Nineveh and in all the rest of the country. So how that can be sectarian when the Shia die for the Sunni to return to their home?
Right, and that makes a good point, because I think, based on what you said and what I've at least basically understood, is this is kind of a Saudi Arabian talking point that's being echoed from think tanks funded by the Saudis in the UAE and Qatar, because the Saudis will need to paint, for example, Yemen as a kind of proxy battle between them and Iran, when I've heard a lot of people say that the Iranian influence on the Houthi rebellion is actually very much overstated. But if you can frame it, as the Saudis want to, as a sectarian war with Iran, this grand battle for influence among sects, then doesn't that give you a lot of cover for the crimes they're committing in Yemen?
Yes, that's true. I mean, the Saudis and the Iranians have been at war for control and power in the region since the fall of the Shah in 1979. This is not a secret. This is something that is known and visible. And Saudi Arabia is financing any war against Iran or any group and fighting any group that is close to Iran. If you've raised the point of Yemen, they are Houthi, they are Zaydi, they are very close to the Sunni rather than to the Shia. It is not a fight for ideology. I thought it's a fight for control. Who's going to control Yemen? And yes, Saudi Arabia is financing these wars and will continue doing so under the title of fighting Iran. And what they did recently is they said to Donald Trump, okay, what is your weight? How much do you weigh? And he said, I weigh $480 billion. Say, okay, we pay you $480 billion, and then you let us do what we want. And this is what he's doing. He just allows Saudi Arabia, he's calling Saudi Arabia the country that is fighting terrorists. When we have 15 Saudis of 19 and 9/11, when we see the Saudi ideology and the hate speech still continue at school in their books, and they become the elite of the world fighting terrorism, that's fine. If he's happy with that, and they are happy, and they're doing everything, and now they're fighting Qatar. And luckily they're fighting Qatar, because Qatar is considered the Al-Qaeda. And now suddenly we see Qatar defeated in Lebanon, and everybody wants to fight Al-Qaeda defeated in Lebanon, and everybody wants to fight Al-Qaeda in Idlib. Everybody suddenly is looking at Al-Qaeda in Idlib and saying, wow, this is a big danger we have to eliminate. Now they're waking up now, and they were financing it and supplying to weapons. So and Qatar and Saudi Arabia are both Wahhabi, by the way. Right. And the Qatar considers itself as a descendant of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, the religious leader of the Wahhabi in the world, in the Islamic world. So therefore, Saudi Arabia can switch on and off its guns against one country to another under a different title. But at the end of the day, it's a struggle for power.
Elijah, what you just two points I want to make real quick. Speaking of southern Iraq, I saw something about a border crossing between Iraq and Saudi Arabia that had been closed for a lot of years and is now reopened. Is that a big deal, or is that a nothing burger?
The borders between Saudi Arabia and Iraq was active to a certain point during the American invasion of Iraq, and then it stopped only when ISIS started to attack that part in 2014. Otherwise, the point of Ar'ar, when going down from Anbar toward the area of Karbala on the west, right, and Ar'ar on the east, that part of the border was available and was open between the two countries. It has been closed for a few years when ISIS was around and attacked the Iraqi Jordanian borders and the Iraqi Saudi borders, so that very far one from another. And it's returning because Saudi Arabia can see in some leaders in Iraq their unhappiness of the relationship with Iran, and there's a lot of going on between Iran and Iraq that is a very big issue and a big conversation. I'm writing a few articles about it for the next week. You may probably see it. But yes, the Saudi Arabia is trying to take advantage of the feeling that is growing against Iran among only certain milieu in Iraq, taking advantage of these, like the example of Muqtada Sadr, that is not necessarily the enemy of Iran, but he's against the Iranian influence in Iraq. And he's very much willing to walk along the Saudis because he can benefit from it in the next forthcoming elections, parliamentary elections in Iraq, due for next year.
Is that what I'm trying to recall, but the new prince, the young prince bin Salman,
Mohammed bin Salman, yes.
Yeah, that meeting that you had posted a picture of a meeting with him, and who was he meeting with? I now don't recall.
Well, Muqtada, this is not the first time that Muqtada goes to Saudi Arabia. I can tell you in 2006 when he fled to Iran and he was in Iraq, this is very few people know about it. So I was there, I was in Iraq, and I know a few extra details. So when Muqtada Sadr fled to Iran, the Iranians offer him a villa and a swimming pool and guards and everything.
Oh.
And there, he was not under the Iranian influence at all. And at a certain moment, I remember Qasem Soleimani calling some people and saying, can anyone talk to Muqtada? He wants to go and visit Bandar bin Sultan, and I have no clue why he's going there. And Bandar is working against us and against Iraq, and he's supplying weapons to Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But Muqtada went, and he didn't care really about what Soleimani is thinking or is saying. So this is Muqtada. Muqtada is a very peculiar personage, that he does what he wants, and not everything that he does is very logical.
Right. I mean, he almost there was a standoff at one point, if I remember correctly, between al-Sadr and the U.S. Army. Right. It was what was it? Sadr City? I can't remember.
In 2004, they fought in Najaf between Jaysh al-Mahdi that used to be under Muqtada's control. He formed Jaysh al-Mahdi, and then they fought the Americans, and then the fight continued in a Sadr city and in other part, and then Muqtada formed Asa'ib Ahl al-Haq that was later on taken by one of his lieutenants, who split from the command of Muqtada, and then the Iranians split Muqtada's army into 3-4 parts, but Muqtada still enjoy a very large support of the population, and particularly those in the south who were always very faithful to the family of his Sadr.
Right, his father
was his father, yes. Yes, Muhammad bin Sadr.
Yeah, but there was apparently one moment in particular where I heard, at least from someone who was in the U.S. military over there, that there was actually a plan to go in and take him, but they decided in the last minute that it would to actually move in on him would be so destabilizing that the U.S. occupation forces essentially threw up their hands and said, whatever. There was a big standoff, though.
Well, I tell you something. The first time he was saved by Sistani himself, because Sistani was in London when Ayad Allawi, at that time Prime Minister, decided to finish off Muqtada Sadr and his army. And he sent his forces to Najaf, and that was the Battle of Najaf. Then the Grand Ayatollah Sistani was doing medical exams in London. He returned via Basra, and then he went from Basra to Najaf, and he forced Allawi to give up on killing Muqtada or to finish off Jaysh al-Mahdi. And it was Sistani who saved Muqtada at that time. Although Muqtada tried to kill Sistani at a certain point in 2004 and send a few crazy guys on top of his house, and that's something that has not been shared until today. Now I'm sharing it with you. So, and then Muqtada went to Baghdad, and he went to Sadr city, and then he was going on and off. But the Americans didn't want to have the insurgency of Al-Qaeda on their back and the entire Shia on their back, particularly the followers of Muqtada Sadr. And killing Muqtada would have been against the interest of the U.S., although Muqtada was very much convinced that the Americans want to kill him, This is why he fled to Iran. And he used to return from Iran to Iraq and stay for 3-4 days and then go back using different routes and always using Basra, by the way. Because he was convinced the Americans want to kill him. And then, and I don't think the Americans, I think the Iranians supported Muqtada until a certain point, until 2009. And after 2009, things have started to split between Muqtada and the Iranians. And this is when Muqtada declared a kind of full separation from Iran, although Iran remained to the same pace, paying Muqtada money, trying to bring him closer, but Muqtada always kept a distance, and he was always independent. And now Muqtada is very close to the Marja'iyya, is very close to Sistani, and he coordinates everything with the Grand Ayatollah in Najaf, and he's far from being pro-Iranian as people think.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting. You know, one of the talking points from Donald Trump on the campaign trail was that essentially Iraq was taken over by Iran, and that, you know, Iran is this threat, sort of going into the Saudi narrative of the Cold War. I just wonder what happens, do you think happens after ISIS is defeated and, you know, everyone sort of takes a breath and says, okay, what are we going to do about Iraq now? Do you think, because there is a movement, at least in the U.S. and D.C. policy circles, to say Iran has too much influence, not just in Syria, but in Iraq itself, and that the reason this whole thing broke out in the rise of ISIS is because the U.S. withdrew. And if the U.S. hadn't withdrawn from Iraq, there wouldn't have been – they basically blame the rise of ISIS on Iranian-influenced politicians in Baghdad discriminating against Sunnis, and that discrimination led to a sense of resentment. So I wonder what happens once ISIS is defeated, and in theory, in their view, Iraq goes back to being dominated by Iran. What's your take on that?
You're trying to steal the work of a week of my articles that I haven't published yet. But I mean, I'll give you some brief. Look, first of all, Iraq is never going to be the enemy of Iran, thanks to the American gift of removing Saddam Hussein. Once Saddam Hussein has been removed, the Americans did the biggest favor to the Iranians ever. I mean, I think the Iranians, if it was fair, they should put a statue to George Bush in Tehran.
Oh my God.
Really, because I mean, that was the only person who managed to remove Saddam Hussein from the area and spare Iranians billions of dollars in defense and in supporting the insurgency against Saddam Hussein. So that's one. Second, the ideology that linked the majority of the Iraqis, Shia, in Syria, in Iraq, is exactly the same as the one in Iran, that they both are Shia. Although there's a completely different culture, we'll come back to that. 3, Iraq has the center of the most sacred imams in the country, starting from Imam Hussein in Karbala and Imam Ali in Najaf, and then we have in Baghdad, and then we have in Samarra, and then we have in other part of the country. So the Iranian pilgrimage will always be extremely active, and there will be tens of millions of Iranians visiting the country. So this kind of collaboration will always exist and will always be an ipso facto. Nobody can change it. Now, from the political and the cultural aspect, I can tell you something that I know many people would jump on me now. The Iraqis don't like the Iranians on the whole. I can tell you, when you see Iranian visitors, the Iraqis have something against them, because they say, I spoke to them and I say, why do you have this kind of attitude? And they say, when we go to Iran and when we go to Mashhad to visit the Imam Rida, then they misbehave with us, not only because we are Iraqis, but because we have our bad habits. So the Iraqis are a bit careless about cleanliness and about the way they move in the street. The Iranians are more clean and more focused on what they are doing, and they're more disciplined. The Iraqis are less, so they find the Iranians a bit abrupt with them, so they don't like them. And when they come to the country, the Iranians come with their own food, so they don't spend money, and they invade the shrines, leaving a little space to other people. And these are really small details. That's from the cultural side. But from the political side. Right. I have to think what I can share with you now. So if we start, okay, let's start from 2000 after Ayad Allawi. When Al-Ja'fari came to power, to renew Al-Ja'fari, that was a decision, that was an Iraqi decision. It was not Iranian. When Al-Maliki moved in, this is when Iran started to be more active in Iraq. Not because Al-Maliki was a pro-Iranian. On the contrary, I can tell you Al-Maliki is extremely a radical pro-Al-Maliki and Al-Maliki only. He likes himself.
He's Donald Trump.
Sorry, yeah. I mean, I can tell you something. Al-Maliki, just to give you an example, on the second mandate of Al-Maliki, this is in my presence. I mean, I was around at that time. On renewing his second mandate, no Shia group wanted Al-Maliki as a prime minister. Only Iran wanted Al-Maliki as a prime minister because Al-Maliki was the only one they consider with enough guts to say to the Americans, I am not going to give you military bases and you are going to leave the country. And only because of this reason, the Iranians wanted Al-Maliki back in power. So what they've done is they made several meetings and they have decided that Al-Maliki promises, and that was a document of 18 points where Al-Maliki promised to share power with all the other Iraqi groups. And mainly the one who refused to have Al-Maliki were the Shia groups. These are the ones who rejected Al-Maliki. So Iran managed to convince them to stay in at the condition of Al-Maliki sharing with them the power. And he sent his aide de camp, Sheikh al-Zuhairi, to Tehran and to Beirut. And Sheikh al-Zuhairi signed the document. Upon his return, when Al-Maliki was elected, Al-Maliki said to Zuhairi, I didn't sign, you signed. So he just rejected the signature of the document, and all the Shia groups who formed the coalition and allowed Al-Maliki to become prime minister were against him. And Al-Maliki was stubborn. He was the dictator of the Shia, replacing a dictator Sunni, Saddam Hussein. And he just messed up everything. He created a very bad relationship with the Kurds in Kurdistan. He did not give them the financial support that he promised. He established a bad relationship with the Sunni. The corruption was overwhelming everywhere. The Shia were unhappy, the Sunni were unhappy, the Kurds were unhappy. Nobody was happy with Al-Maliki. And the only thing Iran wanted is just to see the Americans outside Iraq, and they were saying, we can fix everything afterward, which is not true. They can't fix everything afterward. And this is when Abadi came. Al-Maliki wanted to renew for the third term, but the Marja'iyya stood for the first time writing a paper by the Grand Ayatollah Sistani saying Al-Maliki will not be a prime minister. And that was final. And Al-Maliki was not elected a prime minister. Abadi came, and Abadi hates the Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, head of the IRGC Quds Brigade, who is very active and supporting many groups within Al-Hashd al-Shabi in Iraq.
That's why he was favored by the Americans. I mean, we were happy to help Abadi get in there, as far as I know.
Yes, because the Americans take advantage of the situation rightly, and Soleimani behaved in a way that made Abadi very angry with him, because Soleimani worked against Abadi, and he didn't wanted him to be in power. And for the first year, Abadi rightly was convinced that Soleimani was trying to push the Shia in the government to remove him. And this is why Abadi recently, he said to Soleimani that he needs a visa to come in the country, that he needs to stamp his passport when he comes in and out. This is very unusual. And that he cannot come to his office whenever he wants, but he needs an appointment. And if he comes, Abadi used to put him outside his door for 2-3 hours before receiving him.
Oh, well, I mean
there's a little insight with the relationship between Abadi and Soleimani. And now we have the new election coming up. So it's going to be tough, because also the religious leadership in Najaf, that is led by an Iranian from Mashhad, that is the Grand Ayatollah Sistani, is against the Iranian influence in Iraq, but he's not against Iran. So this is the distinction that needs to be clear. Nobody's working against Iran, but they all want Iran not to interfere in Iraq. But at the end of the day, you see, if we look back to 2014, in June 2014, when ISIS occupied Mosul and was taking all the north of Iraq and going down to Baghdad, and they stopped because they didn't have enough gasoline to continue the ride to Karbala and Najaf, and everybody was running away. For 6 months, the Americans didn't support Iraq and watched ISIS taking one city after another. And it was only Iran that supported Erbil in Kurdistan and Baghdad, supplying men, weapons, ammunition, air force, tanks, artillery, and training to stop ISIS advance.
Wait, Iran was in Erbil? The Iranians were supporting the Kurds in Erbil?
Of course. It was Soleimani, who enjoys a very good relationship with Masoud Barzani, who supplied him with weapons and ammunition, and he managed to stop ISIS at the door of Erbil when the Americans didn't interfere for the first 6 months.
Interesting, because the story here is that basically the U.S. finally kicked into gear in Erbil, because Erbil is actually one of the few places that has a lot of U.S., or not one of the few places, but is a major investment of U.S. companies and the U.S. military, and that Erbil was kind of, the way it's framed in our media, is the final straw, that they kind of ignored ISIS or said that we want to stay out, and then they started coming for ExxonMobil and these other places in Erbil, and then suddenly the U.S. said, okay, fine, we got to get in this. Is that a false narrative?
No, that's true. And the Iraqis are very good in saying, thank you very much, but you can keep out or you can come in when we need you. So this is what they did with the Iranians. They say to Soleimani, you are the one who saved us. You are the one who stopped ISIS at the gates of Erbil. But thank you very much. We want the Americans.
Oh, okay. So that's interesting.
It's like a protectorate of, since the early 90s. Americans have been protecting the Kurdish region in Iran, as far as
they had no fly zone. They had a no-fly zone, right?
Yeah, that's correct. They are the one who protected the Kurds in Kurdistan at the time of Saddam Hussein. They established a no-fly zone, and they boomed the area, and the whole part of the country, of the Kurdish area, and all the American and the Israeli and European companies are based in Erbil, and it's an extremely nice place to stay, where all the facilities that you don't find in Baghdad, you find it in Erbil.
Interesting.
You have companies there who can develop the oil. They have the funding and the equipment to develop oil. They have.
Now that Kurdistan will take on board also the very rich city of Kirkuk.
Oh, they are going to take Kirkuk.
Oh, yeah, they will take Kirkuk, no doubt.
I thought Baghdad was furious or adamant, rather, that they would never give up Kirkuk to the Kurds or give it up to a Kurdish autonomy. I thought Kirkuk was like a big stumbling block for getting a deal between the central government in Baghdad and the Kurds. And you're saying because of the Syrian war or because of ISIS, the Kurds have basically locked in Kirkuk and they're not going to even share profits from the oil, or?
Well, if
nothing?
they don't share the profit for the oil and they don't deliver the oil as they are doing now, they can't claim the 17% the constitution allowed them to have. And if they want to declare an independent state, then what they are going to do is the Iraqi and central government Baghdad will close the airspace on Kurdistan. And the Masoud Barzani is in deep trouble today. He is in deep trouble if he declares in an independent Kurdistan or if he doesn't.
Plus, he's not even. He's not even elected. His term ran out years ago, right? So he's not even
3 years ago. Yes, 3 years ago.
Technically, the elected president or prime minister, whichever he is.
Yeah, but I mean, we have many cases like that. We have Abbas in Palestine is the same. That's not an issue. But what I meant by he's going to lose anyway, because if he accepts the referendum and he takes it on board, then he will have a federation or a state that is completely surrounded. So his choice is he will lose more financially. He will be boycotted by the international community, apart from the Americans. Maybe they might recognize him, but that's not sure. And Baghdad is allowed to close the airspace upon him, and there will be harassment on the borders. But if he lay down on Turkey and ask the Turkish support, because it is the only way he can sell his oil via Turkey, because there is no other way, then he will depend on Turkey. And for the Kurds in Kurdistan to depend on Kurdi is even much worse than living with a hectic state or central government in Baghdad not giving you the money or giving you money on and off, etc. And if he doesn't declare an independent state, then why are you doing the referendum? And he will have problem with his own people and saying, so why are you doing it? So
wow.
This move is really a lose-lose win move.
Wow. And so if they defeat, what is really their incentive to defeat ISIS? Because then if they defeat ISIS, and he's going to walk right into this political trap or this political storm, because they'll then have even less support from the U.S. once ISIS is gone.
I mean, the U.S. is not going to support Kurdistan. It's going to take the oil from Kurdistan and try to make business. And they've been trying, and now we see that the Kurdistan is bankrupt. So taking the oil from Kurdistan and Kirkuk doesn't help the central government. And in Iraq in general, in Baghdad and in Kurdistan, these government, central government or provincial government, they are corrupted.
Right, and that's part of the Sunni revolt, right? Or it's part of the reason there was at least initially a constituency for ISIS. But once ISIS is defeated, what happens to the Sunnis and Anbar or other parts of Iraq? Do they just they just bend the knee to Baghdad, or what? I mean, what do they do once ISIS is gone?
Okay, that's a very good question. First of all, what ISIS did, wherever ISIS was in control, that was a Sunni area and Sunni cities. And these cities are really devastated by destruction. So this is what ISIS did to the Sunni. They brought back the Sunni tens of years backward, and they've destroyed the property and the belonging and killed the Sunni in every single city they went to. Now, with a country like Baghdad, like Iraq, I can tell you, I went to hospitals. They don't have money. They don't have money to buy medicines. People are dying there because they don't have medical support. There are no money to fulfill contract in any other social needs apart from the ration of food that is distributed monthly to every Iraqi. Apart from that, there is no money in Iraq. Therefore, they need to rely upon the international community and the Gulf state to provide to the Iraqi government money to rebuild the country. Now, to provide that, there has to be a kind of a trust between the Iraqi government and all the other neighboring and international states. This kind of trust means being under the control of these countries because they are supplying the money, or what? If they want to say, well, give us your money and thank you very much, as nobody is Father Christmas these days. They're not going to give money and just walk away. They want kind of control in the country, and they want to make sure how they can influence Baghdad. Now, in my experience with Baghdad and with the people in the government, the best thing donors can do is to reconstruct themselves and not to pay money. It's really just to offer what Iraq needs by doing it themselves, not through the Iraqis. Otherwise, the money will end up where it has been ending up for the last 13 years, in the pockets of the politicians.
Oh, you're saying direct aid rather than trying to go through the government.
No, I think he's saying come in and just build stuff, right?
Yeah.
So, for instance, take an American company, an American contractor, and get the permits and build something themselves.
I mean, the donors, Americans, Europeans, Middle Easterns, whoever is moving forward, China, Turkey. There's a lot of Turkish stuff in Iraq, by the way. Any country that is willing to contribute, they can come and do it under the supervision of Baghdad, but they have to put the money. These countries should put the money themselves and should construct themselves if they want to make sure that this money is going to invest it in a good place. So to go back to your questions, the Sunni are going to suffer for years ahead because there is no money to reconstruct. The reconstruction is going to be extremely slow, not because they are Sunni, but just because there is no money.
Oh, and so they're not, well, will it be too weak to revolt? Is that, I mean, that might be Baghdad happy if they, ISIS is defeated and they are so economically depressed. And of course, when I say the Gulf states are going to have to be the ones who donate and build, I wonder what their price will be, because if I recall correctly, the Gulf states are the people who provided the initial funding for ISIS in the first place, right?
Yeah, I fully agree with you. And this is why the visit of Muqtada Sadr to Saudi Arabia is looked upon in a suspicious way, because everybody's saying, well, the majority of ISIS leaders are not only Iraqis, but are Saudis. And now we're bringing back the Saudis to our country. Let us be very careful how we deal with the Saudis, because the Saudis are never going to like to deal with the Shia government in Baghdad. It is just against their own ideology.
Elijah, It sounds like the country's in it almost as, how are they going to defend themselves from being torn apart if there's no money, if they have to rely so much on external countries to reconstruct? I mean, I don't understand how they're going to stand up and assert authority over their own territories.
Well, I agree with you. I don't understand it either, because this is why I say, to return to the topic Daniel raised, is Iran can't have a large influence on Iraq, because Iran is not going to inject the money that Iraq needs. It is a large international community that would be responsible to allow Iraq to stand again on its feet, and not Iran, certainly, because Iran is already under the burden of the financial support they provide government and to other groups that are supported by Iran in the area, and to the Yemeni people who are suffering the Saudi embargo and bombing. So Iran is not going to be the one who's going to invest in Iraq what the Iraqi needs. You need a very powerful and rich countries to invest and to rebuild the country. Yes, it is going to be extremely difficult. But we have one point in advantage. It is the population who lived under ISIS doesn't want to live again the same experience, and doesn't want to live again under ISIS, because they saw what ISIS is capable of. So they're not going to say, okay, let's allow ISIS to return, because we're not getting it from the Iraqi government. The only thing they're going to get if they support ISIS is further destruction. So all the analysis that are saying the Iraqi government will challenge a return of ISIS because there is no reconstruction, that, in my point of view, is not correct. ISIS will not return. ISIS will be in a form of insurgency in the country, hit and run. There would be pockets, there would be houses and apartments who will shelter a few cells of ISIS that can just hassle the Iraqi government, but nothing else. They will not return to occupy a city because everybody is witnessing what is the result of ISIS in control of a healthy city, or what's happening afterward, that the city is completely destroyed.
I wanted to bring up one other point, which is related to what we're talking to right now. Is this also true with Al-Nusrah in Western Syria? Because I remember over the past couple of years, you expressed some, big concerns about the fact that Nusra is a strong force, mainly, for a lot of reasons, but one of them being the fact that they were able to win the support of the local population. Now, a little bit earlier when we were talking, you said that the defeat of Nusra, the Qatar-backed Nusra in Lebanon, sort of showed a complete change of heart now. People are starting to say, hey, wait a minute, these people they turned against Nusra, in other words. Is that a very big deal, as I suspect it is? And is that a sort of a better defense than funding and arms and weapons? I don't know if I phrased that properly, but you're saying one of Iraq's best defenses is that the people of Mosul will not allow an ISIS force again. And we also have Idlib and Western Syria, and the local population did accept Nusra. Do we have the same kind of situation over there?
Okay, yes. Today we don't have any more the same situation, luckily, because Al-Nusrah did a very good move by hitting every moderate rebel and kicking out lately the Ahrar al-Sham from Idlib and becoming the only force that controls the city. And why I say luckily, because it is paving the way to be bombed and attacked, and no one is going to defend Al-Qaeda in Syria today for various reasons. So let's start with the point you've raised in Lebanon. The attack against Nusra in Lebanon was, I like to call it Al-Qaeda because choosing all different names means playing the game of Al-Qaeda. So I call it Al-Qaeda. They can change their names every day. It doesn't matter. It's still Al-Qaeda. So it was possible for the Lebanese government to approve the removal of Al-Qaeda from Lebanon only due to the crisis between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and I'll explain.
Oh, okay.
Qatar is known to be the supporter of Al-Qaeda. And Qatar and Saudi Arabia were on the same wave, calling for a regime change in Syria. And Saudi Arabia is in control of the Prime Minister of Lebanon, who is also holding a Saudi nationality, and whose father used to hold also a Saudi nationality, and whose business was implemented in Saudi Arabia with billions of dollars. Now the son is a little bit moving away from this business because of his mismanagement, but he's still the son of the king, more or less. I mean, the virtual son of the king. At least this is what we know. So being adopted by the king, the Prime Minister of Lebanon can't go against the Saudi policy in the Middle East. Now, Lebanon has a particular situation because the force of Hezbollah in the country goes beyond any other force in Lebanon. Therefore, the Prime Minister of Lebanon tried in the past to overcome this problem by creating another Sunni militia to fight against the Shia Hezbollah in Lebanon. This didn't work out for various reasons. First, the Sunni of Beirut are exactly like the Sunni of Damascus. They are businessmen. They're not involved in any ideology, neither Sunni nor Shia. They just want to make business. They want to live in peace. They want to live, and they want to enjoy life. So they are careless about the sectarian issue between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So the prime minister went to push a little bit the Sunnis who are in the north of the country, in Tripoli and Akkar. At the end of the day, he saw that this is firing back against him, first because he doesn't have the strength to match Hezbollah. Second, because once you feed the sectarian monster, you don't control it. So what he found in the country, another line of Sunni that became radicals, and they became pro-Al-Qaeda and pro-ISIS. But that was suitable for Saudi Arabia because at least Hezbollah can't enjoy the control of the country on their own, and there's always another force that can disturb the strength of Hezbollah in Lebanon. Now, the Prime Minister of Lebanon and all the groups around him supported the city of Irsal and the outskirts of Irsal, preventing the Lebanese government from taking a decision to remove ISIS and Al-Qaeda from the city of Irsal and from the outskirts. Now, when the crisis between Qatar and Saudi Arabia started and reached what is reaching today, what happened is Saudi Arabia gave its blessing to the Prime Minister of Lebanon to remove the influence of Qatar from Lebanon by removing Al-Qaeda's influence in the northeast of the country. This is when Hezbollah moved in with the American blessing to remove Al-Qaeda in the country, because the Americans, by the way, support the Lebanese government. They support by intelligence and by supplying weapons. And the Lebanese government and the Lebanese security, not only the Lebanese army, but there are other security institutions in Lebanon who work very closely with the Americans. And it is thanks to the Americans' technology and intelligence that many cells of Al-Qaeda and ISIS were arrested and dismantled before they committed acts of terrorism in the country. That we have to say it when it is needed. So the support of the Americans to remove Al-Qaeda and the support of Saudi Arabia to remove Al-Qaeda gave a free hand for Hezbollah to move against Al-Qaeda. And as we saw, in 4 days, Al-Qaeda was defeated. And Al-Qaeda wanted to leave. They were offered to leave with their own vehicle and their own weapons. They said no. After 4 days, they left with buses. So, and that was in the advantage, not only of Lebanon, but also of the region and of the world, because Al-Qaeda is not going to be limited to Lebanon or to Syria once it becomes strong. But luckily, it's not becoming strong. I'm coming to that. So therefore, the battle that was run by Hezbollah mainly, with the support of the Lebanese army, with the agreement of the Lebanese government, with the support of the government of Damascus, because the government of Damascus accepted that Al-Qaeda crosses its own territory to go to Idlib. That is, the Lebanese government and Hezbollah can't do it without the approval of Syria, because Syria is accepting to allow Al-Qaeda to cross the country with their weapons and not contest that. And also the Syrian Air Force helped Hezbollah by bombing Al-Qaeda for more than 3 weeks before the ground attack by the infantry and the artillery against Al-Qaeda. By bombing, the Syrian Air Force bombed Al-Qaeda strongholds in the outskirts of Irsal every single day before the final attack. So all these circumstances gathered against Al-Qaeda, and it was able, once the political decision has been taken to remove Al-Qaeda, then the military one is easy. These groups are not strong once they face another group or another will to defeat them, then it is not difficult to defeat them. But once they have the cover, the political cover, then it's not possible to defeat them. Now, to the last point, Idlib. In Idlib, they mixed with the population, and they mixed with the Syrian rebels and the moderate rebels and the radical rebels and everybody. And this is when it was impossible for anyone to defeat them.
Right.
So what Giuliani did today, he kicked out everybody. And he said, I am in control today. Ahrar Sham is in crisis. They are split. They've lost the group of radicals within Al-Ahrar that moved from Ahrar to Al-Qaeda. And now Al-Qaeda has all the radicals. And they are alone in Idlib without political cover, without Turkey supporting them, without Saudi Arabia supporting them, and with Qatar caught, they can't support them forever because now the entire international community's eyes are on Qatar, asking Qatar no longer to support terrorism, but allowing Saudi Arabia to do that. But luckily, Saudi is not with Al-Qaeda now, because Qatar is with Al-Qaeda. So therefore, all the circumstances are helping today to defeat Al-Qaeda, particularly when Al-Qaeda went against the Syrians. That is the key. When you lose the support of the population, there is no way you can hide anywhere. And Al-Qaeda today, I presume, Idlib is going to face the same thing as Mosul. Now, who's going to attack Al-Qaeda in Idlib? I think they need to dry Al-Qaeda finance and support and all the supply that is reaching Idlib through the border crossing between Turkey and Syria. If Turkey closes that crossing and Idlib will be completely cut off, there is no way Al-Qaeda can survive. There are more than 1.5 million of civilians in Idlib. These will leave the country. Only those who live in Idlib since always, who are people of Idlib and they were born in Idlib and live in Idlib, only a part of these will remain. Today, Idlib, everyone who is unwelcome in any other part of the country, in Syria or Lebanon, is sent to Idlib. So it's like the bin trash of Syria.
So once Idlib falls, is that the end of the rebellion, or does the Syria war continue just as kind of these, like you said, hit and run from the quote-unquote moderate rebels or whatever remains? I mean, once Al-Qaeda is whipped out of Idlib, given that all the rebels have been pushed into Idlib, whether they come out of Aleppo or anywhere else, they've always been given sort of safe passage to Idlib, which kind of, centralizes it. So once they're defeated, is that the end of the rebellion?
Well, you are asking $1 million question because you've asked the question and you gave the answer at the same time, and I'll explain. If Al-Qaeda is removed from Idlib at the end of the revolution, Ahrar Sham can't stand against the Syrian government. Therefore, Ahrar Sham will have to go to the Turkish occupied area because Turkey occupy a part of Syria in the north, and then they have to live there. And then this is the end of the Syrian revolution. So basically, what the international community is struggling with today by saying, if we finish off Al-Qaeda, who's going to remain? If we don't finish off Al-Qaeda, then we are supporting the presence of Al-Qaeda in Syria that is becoming unwelcome by the regional country, by the same Syrians, by the Syrian rebels, and by everybody else. So what is the less worst case scenario is to end the Syrian revolution and we stop making fun of ourselves. There is no Syrian revolution. It's finished. We have today Al-Qaeda in Idlib, we have Turkey in the north, we have the Americans in the northeast. That's it. And we have the Russian as a second superpower, which came under the request of the central government of Damascus. This is what we have today. We know where is the Syrian revolution. There is no more Syrian revolution. When you see parties meeting for the south of Syria, you see the Americans, the Russians, the Israelis, and the Jordanians. These are the ones who are talking about on behalf of everybody in the south of Syria. When you talk about the ceasefire, you see the Americans and the Russians are meeting. When you talk about some folkloric talk, then you have the Syrian revolution coming and rebels meeting endlessly in Astana and in Geneva and coming out without any result. So today, where is the Syrian revolution? It's finished, it's gone. The comedy is over, with millions of refugees, hundreds of thousands of deaths, and hundreds of billions of dollars of destruction, and a country completely destroyed, and two groups that Al-Qaeda stronger than ever, and a new monster called ISIS that is not going to be defeated so easily. This is what we are left with. So the decision, I don't know what's going to be the decision, but I think at the end of the day, it's going to be, we have to finish off Al-Qaeda by securing some concessions to the Syrian rebels, or what is left of Syrian rebels. And under Syrian rebels, it means, what are the concessions that we're going to give to the Turks and to the Americans?
Interesting. We've kept you a really long time.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Do you, anything else that you want to say to just wrap things up, Elijah? We've held you up. We've kept you for more than an hour, closer to 2.
Well, we still have 30 minutes before the electricity is cut again. So I think, I think the most interesting part now we are observing is in the race in the Badia, that is semi-desert Syria in the southeast, until the Tanaf. That battle is going to finish very soon. I expect it to finish before the end of this month. And then the second major battle, we have the Battle of Deir ez-Zor. And the third biggest ever is Al-Qaim and Al-Bukamal on the borders against ISIS. And then we will be left with Syria without a war, but with Al-Qaeda in Idlib, and the decision has to be made. The removal of Al-Qaeda and the concessions on the negotiation table, who's going to take what, and how the aim to be divided.
Yeah, and that could take a long time to play out, and everyone's still trying to quote unquote establish facts on the ground so that they can get more at the negotiating table. True?
Yeah, I think the Battle of Raqqa is going to end soon. 2-3 months. They are now the Kurds and the Americans are in control of more or less 40% of the city. If you see the strengths of the Kurds and the Arab tribe in the city of Raqqa, you understand the firepower they have that is not capable of taking further areas from ISIS, or is not going to be able to face the Syrian government in the future. So there has to be a negotiation, and the negotiation is around the table, is not in the field. And sooner or later, they have to accept to remove Al-Qaeda. The Americans can't protect Al-Qaeda further. Turkey cannot continue protecting Al-Qaeda. The Al-Qaeda has to be removed from Syria because it is the strongest base of Al-Qaeda in the entire Middle East. Al-Qaeda is never been so strong as today, thanks to Syria and to the support of the regional country and the Americans. Now it seems this is diminishing. The only hope is the political decision to end Al-Qaeda in Syria.
I would think that the decision to end the CIA program might signal that decision has been made here, but there's a huge amount of pushback from the neoconservative political factions to still support programs like that. They don't overtly say support Al-Qaeda, but I guess that's what it boils down to. So I would say that question has to be resolved here. And we also know that some contingent of the military, some influential contingent of the military, is really against any kind of support for Al-Qaeda. Now, maybe they got away with it for a number of years because no one talked about it. It wasn't obvious, but it's now, the curtain's been pulled back on this now. I would say most Americans still don't understand that we were indirectly or even directly supporting Al-Qaeda, but enough people do in the intelligentsia.
Enough people came up with that when Obama was thinking about intervening, and the Republicans in Congress in the U.S. actually said, we're not going to vote to be Al-Qaeda's air force. I remember that as a talking point. Well, maybe the public, I agree, the public might not be aware of it, but
yeah, that's what I mean, just the general public. But the politicians have Tulsi Gabbard, every week saying, stop arming terrorists and introducing bills in Congress. And the think tank guys like Lister and all of his ilk are getting ridiculed constantly online. And I don't know, the journalists, I don't know if they have come around yet. I guess some of them have.
I mean, the journalists are going to survive because they are journalists. They are professionals. They will continue working. People who are in a think tank, they will be jobless or selling shawarma somewhere. Because I mean, with the end of the Syrian war, where is their expertise is going to be? Or their expertise that is, 6-year-old, because of the Syrian war, and their expertise come from the social media, collecting information and saying, I've talked to this person, I've talked to that person. I mean, you send a private message to anyone and then respond. But I mean, this is not how you cover the news. This is not how you learn about the Middle East. You have to go on the ground. And when we go away for a week or 2 weeks or even 3 weeks, we miss so much. We want to return, not because we like to return, but because there are so many events that's happening. You need to go and feel it on the ground. You can't feel it through Twitter. And these think tanks are paid to produce papers and to produce talk and to continue making money on the suffering of Syrians when they say, we have to go against this and we have to make war. I mean, have you lived ever in a country at war? Have you heard bombardment next to you to understand what war means for the civilian population who just don't want to live at war? They don't want to hear bullets whispering next to them. They don't want to hear bombing. They want to feel safe and to think about something else rather than to go and just think about how they're going to go buy their bread and their food for the end of the day, or the gasoline for their car to be able to run away or to go. I mean, they think every day how they want to survive for the next day. And while the think tankers, they think how they can write more articles to call for war. I mean, it's unbelievable. The difference is huge because these people have no experience and they don't understand what they are saying.
Or they're being paid. I mean, in Charles Lister's case, he was working for a think tank that was backed by Qatar.
Of course they're being paid.
So Qatar wants a certain line, or the UAE wants a certain line, and they'll go to Brookings or they'll go to a guy like Charles Lister. And so yes, I think there's a disconnect, and yes, I think there's some moral principle posturing, and then I also think there's some people who are just taking some money, and if you want me to write this, and that gets the paycheck.
Well, some of them are probably misguided, but I mean, it's the magnitude of a paycheck and a career versus a country being decimated, and these people, it's just, I can't. Well, I find it despicable. I really do.
Well, you see, I mean, when they write so many articles in this style, it shows they have talent, but it is misused and displaced. It is not in the right place. This talent is invested in calling for war, in just telling the U.S. administration, you are making mistakes because we have to change the regime, we have to do that. I mean, go and change the rule in your house. Can you do it? You want the country to come and change the regime and change your regime? What are the consequences of changing the regime?
Even after Iraq, even after that, you think they'd be chastened by Iraq. You think they go, man, that didn't really work out. But apparently,
I mean, it's easy to sit in a tank and pretend to think and then produce all this nonsense. Yes, they write very well and they manage to attract the media, and the media quote them. But for me, this talent they have is used in the wrong place.
Yeah, I think that's generous of you, kind. To be honest.
Okay.
But we should probably wrap up, don't you think? Let you go.
Where can people find your work, Elijah?
Oh, it's on my blog and on Twitter. This is all where I am.
Okay.
All right. Well, stay safe, Elijah, and thanks so much for this invaluable information from, on the ground, especially amongst so much misinformation. I've never quite seen anything like it, so I really do appreciate everything you're doing and taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
All right. Thanks.
Okay. Take care. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
And that's our show. I want to thank you for listening, and a special thank you to Elijah Magnier for giving us the interview and his expertise from Baghdad. If you'd like to support the show, please visit us at patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or go to our website at aroundtheempire.com and see for other ways to donate. We really appreciate it. For as little as $5 a month or whatever you'd like to give through PayPal would really help us keep going. Questions, comments, want to yell at me? Dan at aroundtheempire.com. Follow us online at Around the Empire on Twitter, and check out our Facebook page, Around the Empire. See you next time.
Take care, everyone.